Welcome to episode 7 of The Piper in the Cave. This has been recorded on the land of the Awabakal people. I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty over this land was never ceded and that it remains and forevermore will be Aboriginal land. Okay, so that was my attempt at the Monaghan Jig as played by Patsy Touhey. And this is more a work in progress than anything else I've done on this channel. And partly that's just because I think I grossly underestimated the amount of work that this would take from, sort of working out what Touhey did with this tune, which didn't take that long, but internalizing it and then trying to make sure I get all the bits in some kind of a coherent performance is still something I'm very much working on. Partly that's because Touhey was just so good. I don't think I need to feel too bad about not living up to that. And this performance I think stands as one of his absolute milestones too. But also I think it's because those are not generally, it's not a style or sounds I tend to use so much in my playing, much as I love it. And so, I'd stand a better chance of replicating someone like Willie Clancy, who's also very good. Not replicating, but doing some justice in a replication of Willie Clancy than Touhey. But I think there's a lot of value in picking something that appeals to you and trying to work out what makes it work and how you can use ideas from that in your own playing. Okay, let's talk a little about this tune and Touhey's recording of it. So this is one of the wax cylinder recordings that showed up in an attic in Milwaukee, I think around 2003 maybe. You can find them online. It's called the Dunn Family Collection. I think there were 16 wax cylinders, all I believe made by Francis O'Neill, but which were thought lost for the best part of a century, I guess. And so yeah, an incredible resource, not just for Touhey, amongst other pipers. Sergeant Early, Barney Delaney are also there, as well as some incredible fiddlers like McFadden and so on. So an incredible resource, which is all available free online, if you're at all interested in the early history of piping or Irish traditional music more broadly. This tune in particular, I think, as I said, stands as like one of the pinnacles of Touhey's playing. So an incredible thing to discover. And if your only exposure to Touhey has been the release by Napibri Ellen, which was I think originally a cassette and then a CD, you won't find the Monaghan Jig on that because this emerged after that was released and then re-released. So yeah, have a listen if you haven't already. This is a tune, the Monaghan Jig, fairly familiar to a lot of people, I think. Comes up in sessions, at least in my neck of the woods, fairly regularly. And it's quite well attested in early recordings. There's this one, Michael Coleman also has a really beautiful recording of this from a similar era, and maybe a little later, and then there's also the version in O'Neill's written collection, which is different. They're all different, but the O'Neill's one is perhaps the most different. So he attributes that to a Mr. Gillan, and looking into that, this was a fellow enthusiast of the music, a fellow emigrant to the US, who had this collection of notation he had transcribed from players around the Longford area. So I think probably the version in O'Neill's is from that collection itself. So maybe what I'm about to talk about is a difference between Irish and Irish-American interpretations of this tune, though it's probably speculating a bit too much from a bit too little evidence there. But nevertheless, the version in O'Neill's is only 3 parts, so basically the first 3 corresponding to them, and is a bit, I'd say, smoothed over in a way. So maybe the first bar even is a good example there. So as I played it, as Touhey plays it, B, G, E, E with a cran. Whereas the O'Neill's, and probably the one you hear most in sessions, I think, is I think I put in a bit of Touhey there too, but in that first bar anyhow, has a prominent F sharp, whereas the Touhey one kind of chooses a place to sit and stays there. It's a bit boxier in how it's constructed, I think. And just in general, he's almost fixated on the kind of the harmonic structure of the tune in a sense. So, you know, the first 3 notes are in E minor arpeggio. And in general, if you forget what the next note is and you were to guess an E, a G or a B, you'd actually be right a lot of the time, most of the time. He really focuses a lot on just getting the most sort of variations and inversions and possibilities out of very limited means, you know, in that second part. Sorry. You know, still, it's moving more melodically, but it's still really based around E's, G's and B's, and then moving from them to the next one of them, and so on. So it's interesting, I think, in that it's quite complex, but also kind of, I almost want to say square. It moves in just thoroughly logical ways. And to me, this really has the feel of something that he, like a compositional exercise or an exercise in interpreting this tune, where he came up with some ideas and was happy with those and stuck to them. It doesn't have quite the same freewheeling quality of some of his playing. It's just a little more focused in that way, I think. The notable exception is that sort of quite flamboyant variation he does, where he goes up to the high D in the third part, which I tried to do there too. Which you probably noticed. But other than that one sort of moment of excitement, he really tends to play the same things the same way throughout, and does so very effectively, I think. So all of that sort of lends a sense of predictability and logic to this performance. But at the same time, I think he does a few things to then sort of offset that predictability and squareness, even if I don't hate that word, even though it sounds like I'm having a dig. I'm really not. So, for instance, again, let's talk about the first bar. Most times I play that combination of notes. I would myself would play. Don't know if you heard the difference there. He always does a cut on that first E. So adding, almost extending the cran so that it begins earlier. And that sort of just gives this emphasis off the beat where you don't quite expect it. Preempting where the main beat is. In a way, what I would tend to do emphasises where the main beat is. Let's do it with some foot taps. As opposed to Touhey. And just a little detail that may not be important, but I think because there's then so many cuts, I'm actually playing the last one as a tap. So I'm playing cuts F sharp, G, A, and then a tap. But you could do another A cut even. I think I'm partly doing that just to sort of even out the load between the fingers so it doesn't get too reliant on this one finger, which can kind of drag things back. And then again, when he goes for the D cran, rather than playing, he plays exactly the same thing. Then in the third part, which really mirrors the first part in some ways, same thing. Puts a cut, quite a strong one, before that cran proper begins, so that it almost implies it preempts the beat a little. If you're not a fan already, spend some time listening to Touhey's crans, because they're just so crisp and yet not so compressed that they lose that sort of rhythmic function and just become bristly things. They're always really just well placed. Okay. Yeah, well, we're on that. So I mentioned the first and third parts have a kind of internal relationship, and I would say the first and third and the second and fourth parts are related, which almost gives it an impression of you have your first two parts and then you have your variation on the first two parts, which are the third and fourth parts. So, you know, the first and third based on those crans. And Touhey plays them quite open, especially for his style. And then the second and fourth move a bit more melodically. And, move a bit more melodically, and he tends to play those a bit tighter. That was kind of a mixture of the second and fourth parts, but maybe you get the point. So again, there's sort of quite formal logic underlying this structure, even when he's doing things to just throw you a little. Just a few more things to talk about here. So, the first one is what I just mentioned. So he's doing crans on the second octave E throughout this. However you want to do them, whichever combination of fingers. But that's, you know, something I think some pipers prefer not to do. They really stick to crans on the first octave D and E, and then prefer rolls or staccato things on the second octave E. I'm interested in that in general. I think one thing, there's two reasons you may want to avoid a cran on the high E. One is that it's easy, if you're cutting with the A, that will then drop. Like that. You know, if your chanter's liable to do that, you may avoid it. And I think the other is that if you're not very crisp with those cuts, it can sort of sound like an old phone ringtone or something. I don't know. If they become a bit more open, it loses that rhythmic function quicker than it does in the low octave. To my ears at least. You can get away with some slower cuts down low. And that's also a helpful remedy if it is liable to drop. Making that A cut as snappy as possible will give it the least possible window to drop. Obviously, you can't do a crown on the second octave D as you would the first octave D because it's the thumb. But for the record, on whistle and flute, where you can, I'm very much do D crowns in the second octave person too. But you may differ on that. And while we are on dropping the octave, just want to draw your attention to the second part, because what he does is frankly extraordinary, and I cannot even begin to imagine how you do that. So what's happening is he's dropping from a high G to a low G, and then he's doing that all tight. That to me is mind-blowing, that you'd have, especially at the speed he's playing at, the control to go without doing that. And then the same on the E. So what I've done, because I can't hope to replicate that, is use cuts to actually help me there. And there's other places you can do this in other tunes too. Yeah, don't know if I can think of an example right now, but so what I mean is the high G, taking advantage of the fact that will sometimes drop when you cut it. Right, so if you're doing it with slightly less than perfect pressure, or maybe with too many fingers open or something. Oh, no, that didn't do it. And if you want to make it more likely to drop, you might cut with a higher finger. So if you cut with that top finger, it's almost guaranteed to drop. And the same with the high E. You know, a lot of people like to cut their high E's with a G, because it's less likely to drop. But if you do use the A, and make sure your pressure's, at a point where it's liable to drop, then you can actually use that cut to control your drop. So it's a situation in which the thing that annoys the hell out of you 99% of the time, you can actually turn into an asset. This instability in holding the top octave when you cut, and use that to control a drop into the low octave, if that makes sense. So I'll just play that bit once more. Okay, just one thing I wanted to mention before and didn't, so it would have fit better in the conversation earlier, but here it is anyhow. So I was talking about things he does to kind of make the, having made the form and the melody quite logical, he does a few things to make it a little surprising here and there. And another one of those is at the very end of each part. Is how it goes. And he's always always stopping the chanter and starting again on that last three notes. Oh, sorry. And then going legato into the start of the next part. Which has, that same kind of unexpected effect, you would think. the easiest thing to do, but that's sort of the logical phrasing. You play, and then your next part begins. But by doing this, he's kind of almost implying that the part begins before it begins. It's not something you do naturally, which makes me think that he's doing it quite intentionally here. Sort of overemphasizing that. But hopefully you get the point that it really is like phrasing against the assumed or most logical, most expected structure of the tune. Which means he can get away with this kind of laser-like logical focus on the melody without it becoming too clinical. I think it's just enough to kind of make you think, oh, that wasn't quite what I expected suddenly, even though in many ways he is doing some not predictable but entirely logical and obvious in some way, at least once you hear them, things. Okay. One very, very final thing, just a caveat, I guess, which maybe could have come earlier too, but playing this one without drones or regulators, partly because, like I said, it's really hard, and just having a bit more focus on the chanter makes it more likely I'll get more things as I want them. But also, in a performance, I would kind of perhaps do it that way and then think about going into another tune, slamming the drones and really getting more involved with regs. So maybe, if I can remember how the last part goes, maybe I'll do a bit more than that. But yeah, that was quite an intentional choice, because I would sort of like to just draw attention to the chanter work for this, and then have the opportunity to, in a performance when I'm following it with something different, kind of really change the texture and quality. All right, thanks for joining me today, and I hope to see you next time.